The thundering hooves of a lone mare cut through the silence of the Montana wilderness as Winifred Blackett, face streaked with tears and determination, rode toward the only place she had left to call home. The year was 1876, and the weight of her father's weathered ranch deed pressed against her chest like a brand. The Double B Ranch, her inheritance, her burden, and according to every man in Wallace County, her imminent failure. Wind whipped through Winifred's chestnut hair as she crested the final hill overlooking the sprawling valley. The ranch house stood proud against the backdrop of the snow-capped mountains, though its weathered boards and sagging porch told tales of recent neglect. Her father's absence already evident in every corner of the property. 3 weeks had passed since they'd lowered Thomas Blackett into the unforgiving Montana soil, and Winnie had spent each day since fighting against the tide of opinion that a woman, especially one just 22 years old, had no business running a cattle ranch. As she approached the barn, the sound of hammering drew her attention. A tall figure worked on the corral fence, his broad shoulders moving rhythmically with each strike. Winnie didn't recognize him, but the Stetson hat and worn leather chaps marked him clearly as a cowhand. She slowed her horse, watching cautiously. "Excuse me," she called, her voice carrying across the yard. "Who might you be, and what are you doing on my property?" The man turned, revealing a sun-weathered face with eyes as blue as the Montana sky. He removed his hat and gave a respectful nod. "Mason Buchanan, madam. Your father hired me on last month. I've been tending to things since his passing." His eyes held steady on hers. "My condolences for your loss." Winnie dismounted, her boots hitting the dirt with a soft thud. "I appreciate that, Mr. Buchanan, but I don't recall my father mentioning any new hands. He wouldn't have had the chance, I reckon. I arrived just before he took ill." Mason replaced his hat, squinting against the late afternoon sun. "I've been keeping the place running best I can until you arrived." Suspicion flickered through Winnie's mind. "That's mighty considerate, though I'm curious why you'd stay on without knowing if you'd be paid." A hint of a smile touched his lips. "Your father spoke highly of you, Miss Blackett. Said you had his stubbornness and twice his smarts. Figured you'd need all the help you could get, and I wasn't about to abandon the responsibility he entrusted to me." Winnie studied him, noting the calluses on his hands and the honest way he held her gaze. "Well, Mr. Buchanan, I appreciate your loyalty to my father's memory, but I should inform you that I intend to run this ranch myself." "I heard as much in town," he replied, driving another nail into the fence post. "They're saying all manner of things about a woman taking over Thomas Blackett's spread." Winnie's chin lifted. "And what do you say about it, Mr. Buchanan?" Mason paused, hammer mid-swing. "I say a ranch needs running by someone who cares for it. Man or woman makes little difference to the cattle." Before Winnie could respond, the sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. 3 riders approached from the main road, the center figure unmistakable even at a distance. Horace Wilkins, owner of the neighboring ranch and the most vocal opponent of Winnie's inheritance. "Looks like you've got company," Mason observed quietly, stepping down from the fence. Winnie straightened her back and brushed the dust from her riding skirt. "Mr. Wilkins has been trying to buy this land since before my father took ill. I suspect he's come to make another offer." "Miss Blackett," Horace called as he dismounted, his expensive boots gleaming despite the dusty road. At 50, his hair had gone silver, but his imposing frame and sharp eyes had lost none of their intimidation. "I heard you'd finally arrived from Boston." "Philadelphia, Mr. Wilkins," Winnie corrected, standing her ground as the 3 men approached. "And yes, I've come to take up my father's legacy." Horace's gaze flickered to Mason before returning to Winnie. A fine sentiment, but perhaps impractical. Running a cattle ranch requires experience, strength, and business acumen that few women possess. Fortunately, my father believed I possess all three, Winnie replied evenly. And as his sole heir, the decision is mine alone. Horace smiled thinly. Of course, but I'd be remiss not to repeat my offer. $20,000 is more than fair for this land, especially given its current circumstances. The Double B is not for sale, Winnie said firmly. Not at any price. One of Horace's companions, a thin man with sharp features, snickered. You won't be saying that come winter, Miss Blackett, when you're facing rustlers and wolves alone. She won't be alone, Mason interjected, stepping forward to stand beside Winnie. The unexpected alliance sent a ripple of surprise through all present. Miss Blackett has hired me on as her foreman. She won't do it alone. Winnie glanced at Mason, startled by his declaration but quick to mask her surprise. She hadn't hired him as anything, let alone foreman, but contradicting him now would only weaken her position. Horace's eyes narrowed. I see. Well, Buchanan, I hadn't pegged you as the type to hitch your wagon to a failing enterprise. But then, you've always been a bit of a drifter, haven't you? I know quality when I see it, Mason replied calmly, both in land and in people. A tense silence fell over the group before Horace tipped his hat mockingly. Very well. We'll see how long your conviction lasts when the real work begins. Good day, Miss Blackett. He turned to leave, then paused. You might want to check your northern fence line. Seems some of your cattle have been wandering onto my property lately. I'd hate to have to charge you for their grazing. After the riders departed, Winnie turned to Mason with confusion and gratitude warring in her expression. Why did you do that? You don't even know me. Mason met her gaze directly. I know enough, and I meant what I said. Running this place alone would be near impossible for anyone, man or woman. So you appointed yourself my foreman. There was a hint of amusement beneath her challenge. You need one, I need work. And we both need to prove Wilkins wrong. He extended his hand. Partners. Winnie hesitated only briefly before taking his calloused hand in her smaller one. Partners, Mr. Buchanan, but understand this, I will be running this ranch. I'll value your experience and counsel, but the decisions will be mine. Wouldn't have it any other way, Miss Blackett. His hand was warm around hers, his grip firm but gentle. And you might as well call me Mason, seeing as we'll be working side by side. Winnie, she offered in return. Only the banker calls me Winifred, and that's reason enough to avoid it. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the valley, Winnie felt something she hadn't experienced since receiving news of her father's death hope. The Double B ranch might not be lost after all, not if she had anything to say about it. And perhaps, just perhaps, she'd found an ally in the most unexpected of places. That night, after Mason had shown her the improvements he'd made to the barn and introduced her to the three other hands who'd stayed on Jorge Mendez, an experienced wrangler, Charlie Two Trees, a half-Blackfoot tracker, and young Sam Peterson, barely 18 but eager to prove himself, Winnie sat alone on the porch of her father's house. Her house now. The vastness of the Montana night sky stretched above her, stars glittering like diamonds scattered across black velvet. The responsibility she'd taken on weighed heavily, but there was freedom in it too. Here, 1,000 miles from Philadelphia society and its restrictive expectations, she could finally be herself, the woman her father had raised her to be before her mother had dragged her east for proper finishing. A soft footfall on the porch steps alerted her to Mason's presence. He carried 2 steaming mugs. Thought you might want some coffee, he said, offering her one. Nights get cold up here, even in summer. Thank you. She accepted the mug gratefully, wrapping her fingers around its warmth. I'd forgotten how quickly the temperature drops after sunset. Mason leaned against the porch railing, his silhouette outlined against the star-filled sky. First day back is always the hardest. Tomorrow will be better. Will it? Winnie sipped the coffee, finding it surprisingly good, strong, and flavorful without being bitter. Tomorrow I need to assess our cattle count, check the finances, and apparently inspect the northern fence line. Already done, Mason replied. The fence, that is, rode out there after Wilkins left. It's solid as can be. He's lying about strays. Why would he do that, testing you? Seeing if you'll accept his word without question. Mason turned to face her. Horace Wilkins has been trying to piece together an empire for years. Your father refused to sell, which made him the last holdout between Wilkins and controlling all the water rights in this valley. Winnie nodded slowly. So he's hoping I'll be easier to intimidate. That would be my guess. Mason's voice held a note of admiration, though he might have miscalculated. He certainly did. Winnie set her mug down on the small table beside her chair. Mr. Buchanan Mason, I appreciate your support today, but I need to know what you're really after. Men don't typically champion a woman's right to run a business unless they stand to gain something. Mason chuckled softly. Fair question. Truth is, I've been drifting for years, taking work where I could find it. Your father offered me not just a job but a purpose. He spoke so highly of you that I was curious to meet the daughter who'd impressed Thomas Blackett so thoroughly. He paused, his expression growing serious in the moonlight. When I heard the talk in town that you'd be forced to sell because a woman couldn't possibly manage a ranch well, that didn't sit right with me. So it's about principle, Winnie asked skeptically. Partly. Mason looked out over the darkened landscape. My mother ran a farm after my father died in the war. Everyone said she couldn't do it, that she should sell and move in with relatives. She refused, kept that farm going through droughts and blizzards, raised me and my sisters on her own. His voice softened with pride. So when I hear men like Wilkins declaring what a woman can't do, I tend to disagree. The revelation shifted something in Winnie's perception of him. Your mother sounds like a remarkable woman. She was. The past tense hung in the air between them. She taught me that courage doesn't look the same on everyone, but you know it when you see it. He straightened, finishing his coffee in one long swallow. I saw it today when you faced down Wilkins. Warmth that had nothing to do with the coffee spread through Winnie's chest. Thank you for that. And for staying on even before you knew I was coming back, Mason nodded. Get some rest, Miss Blackett. Dawn comes early and we've got a full day ahead. As he descended the porch steps, Winnie called after him. Mason, he turned, hat in hand. I'm glad my father hired you. A smile touched his lips, visible even in the dim light. So am I, Winnie. So am I. Sleep came more easily than Winnie had expected, the familiar creaks and settling sounds of her childhood home welcoming her back after 8 long years away. She awoke before dawn, the habits of her Eastern schooling still ingrained despite her eagerness to return to ranch life. Dressing in a practical split skirt and sturdy blouse, she plaited her hair and secured it at the nape of her neck. Her mother would have been scandalized by her appearance, but practicality would need to outweigh propriety if she was to succeed here. In the kitchen, she was surprised to find a coffee pot already warm on the stove. A note in a neat, masculine hand rested beside it. Rode out early to check the herd, back by breakfast. The thoughtfulness of the gesture brought a smile to her lips. Winnie poured herself a cup and stepped onto the porch to watch the sunrise paint the eastern sky in magnificent hues of gold and crimson. This land, with its sweeping vistas and untamed beauty, had called to her even during her years in Philadelphia. Now it was hers to protect and nurture. By the time Mason returned, Winnie had cooked a substantial breakfast of flapjacks, bacon, and eggs. The other hands arrived shortly after, their surprise at finding the boss's daughter in the kitchen quickly replaced by appreciation for the hot meal. "This wasn't necessary," Mason said quietly as he filled his plate. "Maybe not, but it seems only fair. You've been caring for my father's ranch in my absence. I can certainly provide a decent meal in return." She passed him the maple syrup, their fingers brushing momentarily. "Besides, I wanted to get to know the men who have stayed loyal to the Double B." The meal provided exactly that opportunity. Jorge, in his 50s with salt and pepper hair and a weathered face, had worked for her father for over 20 years. He shared stories of Winnie as a child, riding her pony across the fields and learning to rope from the ranch hands. Charlie was more reserved, but his knowledge of the land and its wildlife was encyclopedic. He promised to show Winnie the new calves born during the spring season, his usual stoicism warming when he spoke of the animals. Young Sam, eager and talkative, asked dozens of questions about Philadelphia and whether Winnie had attended fancy balls. His innocent curiosity made her laugh for the first time in weeks. After breakfast, Mason unrolled a map of the ranch on the kitchen table. "Your father kept excellent records," he explained, pointing out the grazing areas, water sources, and boundary lines. "We've got about 800 head of cattle now after spring calving." Winnie studied the map carefully. "And how many were lost during winter?" "Fewer than usual," Jorge interjected. "Your father moved the herd to the southern pastures before the worst storms hit." "We lost maybe 30 head total." "That's impressive," Winnie acknowledged. "What about the finances?" Mason hesitated. "That's where things get complicated. Your father was land rich but cash poor toward the end. Medical bills took a lot of what was set aside. And the cattle drive." Father always planned a summer drive to Helena. "Still on schedule for next month," Mason confirmed. "We've got buyers lined up, but we'll need to hire a few more hands to make the drive safely." Winnie nodded, making mental calculations. "If the drive is successful, that should give us operating capital for the next year at least. Provided we don't have unexpected expenses," Charlie added quietly. "What kind of expenses?" Winnie asked. The men exchanged glances before Mason spoke. "There have been some incidents lately. Calves going missing, salt licks tampered with, that sort of thing." "Rustlers?" Winnie frowned. "Maybe," Mason replied, but his tone suggested doubt. "Or maybe someone's trying to create problems where none exist." "Wilkins," Winnie concluded, the pieces falling into place. "He wants to devalue the ranch, so I'll be forced to sell." "That would be my guess," Mason agreed. "But we can't prove anything." Winnie straightened her shoulders. "Then we'll just have to be more vigilant. I want patrols doubled on the boundaries. And I'd like to meet these buyers in Helena personally." Jorge raised an eyebrow. "The trail to Helena ain't no place for a lady, Miss Blackett." "Perhaps not," Winnie conceded, "but it's exactly the place for the owner of 800 head of prime Montana beef." Her tone made it clear the matter wasn't open for debate. "Now, Mason mentioned the northern fence line. I'd like to see it for myself." An hour later, Winnie rode alongside Mason toward the northern boundary of the Double B. The summer sun warmed her shoulders as they traversed rolling hills covered in lush grass, perfect for grazing cattle. In the distance, small groups of the ranch's herd dotted the landscape, their reddish-brown hides distinctive against the green backdrop. "This is good country," Mason commented as they crested a rise. "Your father knew what he was doing when he claimed this land." "He always said water made the difference between surviving and thriving out here," Winnie replied, feeling a swell of pride at her father's foresight. The creek that runs through our property never runs dry, even in the worst droughts. Which is exactly why Wilkins wants it, Mason pointed out. His land has grazing aplenty but limited water sources. During dry years, he has to move his cattle constantly or risk losing them to thirst. They reached the fence line, which appeared sturdy and well-maintained exactly as Mason had described. No cattle could possibly have wandered through it onto Wilkins' property. See, Mason dismounted to inspect a section more closely. Solid as can be. He was testing you, like I said. Winnie slid down from her mare and walked along the fence, running her gloved hand over the taut wire. I remember helping my father mend fences when I was young. He insisted I learn every aspect of ranching, even the parts my mother deemed unsuitable for a young lady. Your father was a wise man, Mason said, watching her with appreciation. Most fathers would have sheltered their daughters from such work. Not Thomas Blackett. Winnie smiled at the memory. He used to say, knowledge never weighs you down, Winnie girl. The more you carry, the stronger you become. Her smile faltered slightly. I hope he'd be proud of me now. He would be, Mason assured her, his voice gentle. Taking on this ranch when everyone expects you to fail, that takes courage, or stubbornness, Winnie admitted with a small laugh. Mother always said I inherited too much of father's temperament for my own good. Stubbornness has its merits in this country. Mason grinned, the expression transforming his serious face. Out here, they call it determination. A comfortable silence settled between them as they remounted and continued their inspection of the boundary. Winnie found herself studying Mason when he wasn't looking the confident way he sat his horse, the respectful manner in which he addressed her questions, the quiet competence evident in everything he did. He wasn't what she had expected in a ranch hand, though she wasn't entirely sure what she had expected. How long have you been working cattle? She asked as they turned back toward the ranch house, the midday sun high overhead. Since I was old enough to sit a horse, Mason replied. My father ran cattle in Texas before the war. After he didn't come home, my mother kept a small herd going along with the crops. And your sisters, where are they now? Mary's married to a shopkeeper in Denver. Sarah's teaching school in Cheyenne. A shadow of something grief perhaps crossed his features. My mother passed 3 years ago. After the funeral, I found it hard to stay in one place for long. I'm sorry, Winnie said softly. About your mother. Mason nodded his acknowledgement. It gets easier with time. Though I suspect you know that better than most, having lost your own mother years back. Father wrote to me about her passing, Winnie confirmed. It was strange we'd grown apart after she took me east, but hearing she was gone. She trailed off, unable to articulate the complex emotions surrounding her relationship with her mother. Family is complicated, Mason offered. Doesn't mean the love isn't real. The insight surprised her, as did the depth of understanding in his blue eyes when she met his gaze. This man was more than he appeared, and Winnie found herself increasingly grateful for his presence at the Double B. Their ride back was interrupted by the sound of galloping hooves. Charlie appeared over the ridge, riding hard toward them. Miss Blackett, Mason, he called as he approached. We've got trouble at the south pasture. Rustlers took down a section of fence. They've driven off about 50 head. Mason's expression hardened instantly. How long ago? Not more than an hour, Charlie reported. Jorge and Sam are tracking them now, but they'll need help if we're to recover the cattle. Without hesitation, Mason turned to Winnie. Ride back to the ranch house and stay there. We'll handle this. I will do no such thing, Winnie replied firmly, gathering her reins. Those are my cattle, Mr. Buchanan, and I intend to help recover them. Winnie, these men are dangerous, all the more reason to have another gun, she interrupted, patting the rifle scabbard attached to her saddle. "I can shoot as well as any man on this ranch, I assure you." Mason looked as though he wanted to argue further, but Charlie's urgent expression made the decision for him. "Stay close and follow my lead," he instructed Winnie, his tone making it clear this wasn't negotiable. "If there's shooting, you find cover immediately." "Agreed," she said, and the three of them set off at a gallop toward the south pasture. They found Jorge and Sam following tracks through a shallow ravine, moving cautiously to avoid alerting the rustlers to their pursuit. The stolen cattle had left clear signs of their passing trampled vegetation and distinctive hoof prints in the soft earth. "How many men?" Mason asked as they dismounted to join the pursuit on foot, leading their horses. "3, maybe 4, Jorge answered, his experienced eyes reading the tracks. "They're heading for Serpent Canyon. If they get the cattle through there, we'll lose them for sure." Mason nodded grimly. "We need to cut them off before they reach the canyon. There's a ridge that runs parallel to their route. If we can get ahead of them, we might be able to turn the herd." "Or ambush the rustlers," Charlie added, checking his rifle. Winnie listened intently, impressed by the men's strategic thinking. "What can I do to help?" Mason considered her for a moment, clearly weighing his desire to keep her safe against the practical need for another participant in their plan. "You're a good rider, the best in Philadelphia," she replied with confidence. A brief smile touched his lips. "Then you and I will take the ridge route. If we can get ahead of them, we'll need to create enough commotion to turn the herd back toward Jorge and the others." "And if the rustlers resist?" Winnie asked, her hand resting on her father's rifle. "Then we do what's necessary to protect what's ours," Mason answered simply. The plan set, they separated Jorge, Charlie, and Sam, continuing to follow the rustlers' trail while Mason and Winnie rode hard for the ridge that would allow them to intercept the stolen cattle. The terrain grew increasingly rugged as they climbed, forcing them to slow their pace. Mason led the way through narrow passages between towering rocks, his knowledge of the land proving invaluable. Winnie followed closely, determined not to show any weakness despite the challenging ride. "Just ahead," Mason called back to her as they reached the crest of the ridge. Below them stretched a narrow valley that would funnel directly into Serpent Canyon. "They'll have to bring the cattle through here." They dismounted and secured their horses, then took positions behind large boulders that provided both coverage and a clear view of the valley below. Minutes stretched into nearly an hour of tense waiting before Mason spotted movement. "There," he whispered, pointing to the far end of the valley where dust rose from the ground. Soon, the lowing of cattle became audible, followed by the appearance of the stolen herd, driven by 3 mounted men. Winnie recognized the double B brand on the animals even from a distance. Her jaw tightened with anger at the theft not just of valuable livestock, but of her chance to prove herself capable of running her father's ranch. "Wait until they're directly below us," Mason instructed, his voice low and steady. "When I give the signal, we'll fire shots in front of them to turn the herd. And if they shoot back," Mason's expression was grim, "then we defend ourselves." As the rustlers drove the cattle closer, Winnie could make out their features. 2 were strangers to her, rough-looking men with bandanas pulled up to cover the lower halves of their faces. But the third, a tall man on a distinctive sorrel horse, struck her as familiar. "I know that rider," she whispered urgently to Mason. "That's Henry Powell. He works for Wilkins." Mason's eyes narrowed as he studied the man. "You're sure?" "Positive. I remember him from when he accompanied Wilkins to speak with my father last year." This confirmation of Wilkins' involvement changed the situation significantly. No longer were they dealing with random rustlers. This was a deliberate attack on the Double B by their most powerful neighbor. This complicates things, Mason acknowledged. If we can capture Powell, we'd have evidence against Wilkins. Then that's what we'll do, Winnie replied, her determination hardening into resolve. When the rustlers and cattle were positioned in the narrowest section of the valley, Mason gave the signal. Their rifles cracked almost simultaneously, sending bullets into the ground well ahead of the herd. The startled cattle immediately balked, the lead animals turning back and creating confusion among the rest. The rustlers shouted in alarm, trying desperately to regain control of the panicking herd. Powell's voice rose above the others, ordering them to push forward despite the gunfire. Mason fired again, this time aiming closer to the men. "Double B hands, drop your weapons and surrender the cattle." Instead of complying, one of the rustlers raised his rifle toward the ridge where Mason and Winnie were positioned. Without hesitation, Winnie took aim and fired, her shot striking the man's weapon and sending it flying from his hands. "Next one won't miss you," she called out, her voice clear and commanding despite her racing heart. The disarmed rustler raised his hands in surrender, but Powell and the third man drew their revolvers. Gunfire erupted from the other end of the valley as Jorge, Charlie, and Sam arrived, catching the rustlers in a crossfire. Powell's horse reared as a bullet struck near its hooves. The momentary distraction was all Mason needed. He took careful aim and fired, hitting Powell in the shoulder. The man cried out in pain but managed to stay mounted as he turned his horse to flee. "He's getting away," Winnie exclaimed, already running for her horse. Mason was right behind her. "Winnie, wait!" But she was already in the saddle, urging her mare down a rocky path toward the valley floor. Mason cursed under his breath and followed, navigating the treacherous descent with skill born of years in the saddle. By the time they reached level ground, Jorge and the others had subdued the remaining rustlers. The cattle, though agitated, were being held in a loose group away from the canyon entrance. Powell had disappeared into a stand of trees at the far end of the valley. "He's wounded," Mason said as he and Winnie rode to join the others. "He won't get far." "I want him found," Winnie insisted. "He's our proof that Wilkins is behind this." Jorge nodded. "Charlie's already tracking him, Miss Blackett. Best tracker in 3 territories. Powell won't escape him." Mason dismounted to inspect the captured rustlers, both now securely bound. "You men want to tell us who hired you?" The first rustler, a wiry man with a week's growth of beard, spat on the ground. "Go to hell." "That's not very cooperative," Mason replied calmly. "The territorial marshal won't look kindly on cattle rustling, but he might be more lenient if you provide information about who put you up to this." The second rustler, younger and clearly more frightened, glanced at his companion. "We ain't saying nothing without guarantees." Winnie approached, her rifle still in hand. "Here's a guarantee. Tell us the truth about Horace Wilkins' involvement, and I'll personally speak to the marshal on your behalf." "And if we don't?" the first rustler challenged. "Then you'll face the full punishment for rustling, which, as I'm sure you know, can be hanging in these parts." Her voice didn't waver despite the gravity of her words. The younger rustler broke first. "It was Wilkins," he admitted, ignoring his companion's curse. "He paid us to take the cattle and make it look like you couldn't manage the ranch, madam. Said after a few losses like this, you'd be begging to sell." "And Powell, he works for Wilkins, doesn't he? Oversees his North Range," the rustler confirmed. "He was in charge of making sure we got the cattle through the canyon to Wilkins' property on the other side. They'd be rebranded there." Winnie exchanged a triumphant look with Mason. "That's all I needed to hear." Charlie returned shortly after, supporting a pale and blood-soaked Powell. The wound in his shoulder had taken its toll, leaving the man barely conscious. "Found him passed out by the creek," Charlie reported, lowering Powell to the ground. "Lost a fair amount of blood, but he'll live." "Good," Mason said grimly. "We need him alive to testify against Wilkins." The return to the Double B was slow but triumphant. The recovered cattle were herded back to their pasture, the fence mended, and the captives secured in the tack room under guard. Powell's wound was treated by Winnie herself, who had learned basic medical care during her years in Philadelphia. "You're lucky," she told him as she finished bandaging his shoulder. "The bullet went clean through. Keep it clean and you might keep the arm." Powell glared at her but said nothing. His silence mattered little. They had the younger rustler's confession, and physical evidence linking the theft to Wilkins in the form of Powell himself. That evening, as the sun set over the mountains, Mason found Winnie sitting on the porch steps, a glass of her father's whiskey in hand. He settled beside her, accepting the glass she poured for him. "You did well today," he said after a moment. "Not many ranch owners, man or woman, would have ridden into that situation." "It was my responsibility," she replied simply. "These people, this land, these animals, they're all my responsibility now." Mason studied her profile in the fading light, noting the determination in the set of her jaw and the quiet strength in her posture. "Your father would be proud," he said softly. "I know I am." The admission brought a flush to Winnie's cheeks that had nothing to do with the whiskey. "Thank you for standing with me, not just today but from the beginning. I told you she won't do it alone." His voice was low, almost a promise, "and I meant it." Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits finding each other in an unlikely place. Winnie looked away first, not yet ready to examine the warmth that filled her chest whenever Mason was near. "What happens tomorrow?" she asked instead, focusing on practical matters. "We can't keep rustlers locked in our tack room indefinitely." "I've sent Sam to fetch Marshal Dawson from Wallace," Mason explained. "He should arrive by midday tomorrow. Once he takes statements and the prisoners, Wilkins will have some explaining to do." "He'll deny everything," Winnie predicted. "A man like that always has ways to distance himself from his crimes." "Maybe," Mason acknowledged, "but even if he escapes legal consequences, word will spread about what he tried to do. That matters in these parts. A man's reputation is his currency." "And a woman's?" Winnie asked, a hint of challenge in her voice. Mason smiled. "A woman who faces down rustlers and outsmarts Horace Wilkins. I'd say her stock just rose considerably in Wallace County." The compliment brought a genuine smile to Winnie's lips. "Let's hope it's enough to see us through to the cattle drive. We'll need that income to secure the ranch's future." "One day at a time," Mason advised, raising his glass in a toast. "To the Double B and its formidable owner." Winnie clinked her glass against his. "To partnerships that prove the doubters wrong." As darkness settled fully over the ranch, Winnie felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced since receiving news of her father's death. The Double B was still standing, her cattle were safe, and tomorrow would bring justice for those who had tried to take what was hers. Most surprisingly of all, she had found an ally who believed in her capability without question, a rare thing indeed for a woman in 1876 Montana territory. The journey ahead would be challenging, she knew, but for the first time since her return, Winnie truly believed she would succeed. Not alone, perhaps, but on her own terms, and that made all the difference. Marshal James Dawson arrived at the Double B shortly after noon the following day, his weathered face betraying no emotion as he listened to Winnie's account of the rustling incident. A man of few words, the marshal had served the territory for 15 years and was known for his fairness, a quality Winnie was counting on now. "So you're saying Horace Wilkins, one of the most prominent ranchers in the county, orchestrated this theft?" Dawson clarified after hearing the testimony of the captured rustlers. "That's exactly what I'm saying," Winnie confirmed, her posture straight as she faced the marshal across her father's desk. His foreman, Henry Powell, led the operation. Powell himself is in the bunkhouse, recovering from a wound sustained during the recovery of my cattle. Dawson's gaze shifted to Mason, who stood by the window. "You can corroborate this, Buchanan." "Every word," Mason affirmed. "We have 3 witnesses besides Miss Blackett and myself. And Powell's involvement is indisputable. Half the county knows he works for Wilkins." The marshal sighed heavily, removing his hat and running a hand through his graying hair. "This puts me in a difficult position. Wilkins has influence with the territorial governor." "Are you saying you won't pursue charges?" Winnie asked, indignation rising in her voice. "I'm saying I'll need to tread carefully," Dawson replied. "I'll take your rustlers and Powell into custody. As for Wilkins himself," he hesitated. "Without direct evidence that he gave the orders, it's going to be Powell's word against his, and Powell might not be willing to testify against his employer. So Wilkins walks free while his men take the punishment," Mason summarized, his disgust evident. "That's often how these things work," Dawson acknowledged. "But," he added, seeing Winnie's frustration, "this doesn't mean there won't be consequences for Wilkins. As Mr. Buchanan pointed out yesterday, reputation matters out here. Once word spreads that his men were caught rustling Double B cattle, many will draw their own conclusions." Winnie wasn't satisfied, but she recognized the political reality of their situation. "What can we expect next? Will Wilkins retaliate?" "Hard to say," Dawson considered. "He's never been one to accept defeat gracefully, but open aggression would only confirm his guilt in the public eye." After the marshal departed with his prisoners, Winnie retreated to the study to review the ranch's financial ledgers. The rustling attempt had been thwarted, but the incident highlighted her vulnerability. If the upcoming cattle drive failed, she would have few options left to keep the Double B solvent. A knock at the door interrupted her calculations. Mason entered, carrying a stack of mail that had been delivered to Wallace and brought out by Sam. "Anything interesting?" Winnie asked, grateful for the distraction. "Mostly business correspondence," Mason replied, placing the envelopes on the desk. "But there's this." He handed her a telegram that had been among the mail. Winnie opened it quickly, her expression shifting from curiosity to concern as she read the brief message. "It's from the buyers in Helena," she explained. "They're requesting an earlier delivery date for our cattle 2 weeks earlier than planned." Mason frowned. "That's a problem. We're not fully staffed for a drive yet, and moving up the timeline means less preparation." Could Wilkins have something to do with this? Winnie wondered aloud. "Perhaps he has connections with our buyers." "It's possible," Mason acknowledged, "but regardless of the reason, we need to decide how to respond." Winnie stared at the telegram, weighing their options. "If we decline, we risk losing the sale altogether. If we agree, we're undertaking a cattle drive with limited resources and rushed preparations." "Neither option is ideal," Mason agreed. "But I think we can make the earlier date work if we hire additional hands immediately and focus all our efforts on preparing for the drive." "Where would we find reliable hands on such short notice?" Winnie asked. "After today's events, Wilkins will likely spread word that working for the Double B is a poor choice." "Leave that to me," Mason replied with confidence. "There are plenty of good men who'd welcome steady work, regardless of what Wilkins might say. I know where to look." Winnie studied him thoughtfully. "You've become quite invested in the success of this ranch, Mason. May I ask why?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. "I gave my word to your father that I'd see to his land until you arrived, And then I gave my word to you that you wouldn't face these challenges alone." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "Beyond that, I believe in what you're trying to do here. It's not often we get to be part of something worthwhile." The sincerity in his voice touched Winnie deeply. "Thank you," she said simply, knowing no elaborate expression of gratitude could adequately convey her feelings. Mason nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I'll ride into Wallace tomorrow to start recruiting. In the meantime, you might want to wire those buyers back and tell them we'll meet their new timeline." "I'll do that," Winnie agreed, already composing the reply in her mind. "And Mason, choose men you trust implicitly. After today, I realize how fortunate I am to have loyal hands like you, Jorge, Charlie, and Sam." "Trust is earned," Mason replied, "not given. Remember that when we bring on new men." With that advice lingering in the air between them, he departed, leaving Winnie to contemplate not just the logistics of the upcoming cattle drive, but also the growing complexity of her feelings toward her foreman. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of intense activity as the Double B prepared for the unexpected early cattle drive. Mason returned from Wallace with 5 new hands, all experienced cowboys with solid reputations, whom he had worked with on previous drives. Winnie was impressed by his ability to recruit quality men on short notice, especially given Wilkins' influence in the area. The new arrivals brought fresh energy to the ranch. Hank Miller, a veteran drover with 20 years of experience, took charge of training the younger hands in the specific skills needed for the long journey to Helena. Brothers Luke and Matthew Daniels proved exceptionally skilled with horses, expertly breaking in several new mounts purchased specifically for the drive. Frank Turner, quiet and methodical, maintained equipment with remarkable precision, while Will Jensen's cooking skills promised to keep morale high on the trail. Winnie immersed herself in every aspect of the preparations, working alongside the men from dawn until dusk. She helped select the cattle for the drive, mended tack, and practiced her riding skills under Mason's watchful eye, determined to pull her weight during the journey. "You're not actually planning to accompany us on the drive, are you?" Jorge asked one evening as they sat around the dinner table, discussing the route. "Of course I am," Winnie replied without hesitation. "These are my cattle, and I intend to see the sale through personally." The older hands exchanged concerned glances, but Mason spoke before they could object. "Miss Blackett has every right to join the drive, and after seeing her handle herself against rustlers, I'd say she's earned the opportunity." "It ain't about earning," Jorge clarified, his tone respectful despite his disagreement. "It's about the trail being no place for a, if you say a woman. I may have to reconsider your position here, Jorge," Winnie interrupted, though her smile softened the warning. "I grew up on cattle drives with my father. I know the challenges and I'm prepared to face them." Jorge shook his head but offered a reluctant smile in return. "Your father always said you were stubborn as a mule. Guess he knew what he was talking about." The preparation continued at a relentless pace, with each day bringing them closer to their departure. Winnie found herself working most closely with Mason, who seemed to anticipate her questions and concerns before she could voice them. His steady presence became a comfort she hadn't realized she needed, until a rare afternoon thunderstorm drove them to take shelter in an abandoned line shack while checking distant pastures. Rain lashed against the small structure's windows as Mason built a fire in the rusty stove. Winnie removed her soaked outer jacket, hanging it near the growing warmth. "That came up fast," she commented, running fingers through her damp hair. "I'd forgotten how quickly mountain weather can change." "Nature keeps us humble out here," Mason replied, adding another stick to the fire. Reminds us who's really in charge. Winnie settled on a rough wooden chair, watching as Mason moved efficiently around the small space, checking for leaks and securing the door against the wind. There was something reassuring about his methodical approach to even the simplest tasks. "You never panic, do you?" she observed. "No matter what happens, you just handle it." Mason glanced at her, a hint of amusement in his expression. "Panic doesn't solve problems. My mother used to say worry is just prayer for something you don't want to happen." "Wise woman," Winnie commented. "I wish I could have met her." "She would have liked you," Mason said with certainty, settling on a crate opposite her. Strong-willed women tend to recognize each other. The compliment brought warmth to Winnie's cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire. "Tell me more about her," she requested, genuinely curious about the woman who had raised such a man. As the rain continued its steady drumming on the roof, Mason shared stories of his mother, Elizabeth Buchanan, who had run a farm and raised 3 children alone during the turbulent years following the Civil War. Her practical wisdom, unfailing kindness, and fierce determination had shaped Mason's character in ways he was only now beginning to fully appreciate. "She never remarried?" Winnie asked. "Had offers," Mason replied, "but she always said she'd already found her one great love. Didn't see the point in settling for less." "That's beautiful," Winnie said softly, "and rare. Most widows in her position would have remarried for security if nothing else." "Mother wasn't most women," Mason stated simply. "She believed security came from within, from knowing you could face whatever challenges arose." He looked directly at Winnie. "Reminds me of someone else I've come to know." The intensity of his gaze made Winnie's heart quicken. She looked away, suddenly aware of how intimate the small cabin felt with just the 2 of them sheltering from the storm. "The rain's letting up," she noted, changing the subject. "We should head back before it gets dark." Mason nodded, though something in his expression suggested he recognized her retreat for what it was. "You're right. We've got plenty to finish before the drive begins." As they rode back to the ranch through the freshly washed landscape, Winnie found herself contemplating the growing complexity of her feelings toward Mason Buchanan. He had become more than an employee. More than an ally, he was becoming someone she looked forward to seeing each morning, someone whose opinion mattered deeply to her, someone whose presence made difficulties seem less daunting. Such feelings were dangerous, she reminded herself. She had returned to Montana to prove she could succeed on her own terms, not to lose her heart to a cowboy, no matter how admirable he might be. The success of the Double B had to remain her primary focus. Everything else was a distraction she couldn't afford. Yet as they reached the ranch and Mason helped her dismount, his hands steady at her waist and his eyes meeting hers with unspoken understanding, Winnie knew that maintaining professional distance would be her greatest challenge yet. The day of departure dawned clear and crisp, with the first hint of autumn coloring the distant mountains. 800 head of cattle stood ready in the holding pasture, selected carefully for the journey ahead. Supply wagons were loaded, horses saddled, and men positioned for the complex operation of moving the herd onto the trail. Winnie, dressed in practical riding clothes with her hair braided and tucked beneath her hat, sat astride her favorite mare, surveying the organized chaos with a mixture of pride and trepidation. This moment represented everything she had worked toward since returning to the Double B, the culmination of weeks of planning and preparation, against seemingly impossible odds. Mason rode up beside her, his expression serious but his eyes reflecting her own excitement. "Everything's ready, Miss Blackett. Give the word and we'll start the drive." Winnie took a deep breath, savoring the significance of the moment. "Let's begin." At her command, the hands moved into position, Jorge and Charlie led the way with the others spread out along the sides of the herd. Mason gave a sharp whistle, and the cattle began to move, slowly at first, then with increasing momentum as the skillful cowboys guided them toward the trail. Winnie remained at the rear with Mason, watching with satisfaction as the operation unfolded exactly as planned. The thundering of hooves, the billowing dust, the calls of the drovers all combined into a symphony that resonated with memories of drives she had witnessed as a child. "We're off to a good start," Mason commented as the last of the cattle cleared the ranch boundaries. "If we maintain this pace, we'll reach Helena ahead of schedule." "Let's not get overconfident," Winnie cautioned, though she couldn't help smiling. "We've still got a long journey ahead." The first few days on the trail passed without significant incident. The weather remained favorable, the cattle behaved predictably, and the new hands proved their worth repeatedly. Winnie threw herself into the work, taking regular shifts watching the herd and helping with camp duties. Though exhaustion claimed her each night, she found deep satisfaction in the physical labor and camaraderie of trail life. On the fourth night, as they camped along a tributary of the Missouri River, Winnie sat beside the campfire long after most of the men had retired to their bedrolls. The stars overhead seemed impossibly bright, the vastness of the Montana night sky still capable of inspiring awe despite her familiarity with it. Mason joined her, offering a cup of coffee. "Can't sleep, just enjoying the moment," she replied, accepting the cup gratefully. "It's been years since I've experienced this, being on the trail, living under the stars. I'd forgotten how it feels." "Like freedom," Mason suggested, settling beside her. "Exactly." Winnie nodded, surprised by his perfect articulation of her feelings. "In Philadelphia, I was always confined by buildings, by social expectations, by other people's ideas of what a proper young lady should be." "And here," Mason prompted when she fell silent, "here I'm judged by what I can do, not by arbitrary standards of femininity." She smiled ruefully. "Though I'm still fighting to prove myself capable." "You've already proved that," Mason stated with conviction. "Anyone who can't see it isn't looking." The firelight caught the sincerity in his eyes, and Winnie felt that now familiar warmth spread through her chest. "Thank you for believing in me from the beginning," she said softly. "It's made all the difference." "I recognize determination when I see it," Mason replied, "and courage. You have both in abundance." Their conversation was interrupted by Sam, who approached with urgency in his step. "Mason, Miss Blackett, sorry to disturb you, but Luke spotted riders on the ridge to the north. They've been following us since sundown." Mason was instantly alert. "How many?" "3, maybe 4. Keeping their distance but definitely tracking our movement." "Wilkins?" Winnie asked, concern evident in her voice. "Could be," Mason acknowledged, rising to his feet. "Or just curious neighbors. Either way, we'll double the night watch. Sam, tell Hank and Jorge what you saw. 4-hour shifts instead of 6, and no one rides alone." As Sam hurried to deliver the message, Winnie stood as well. "I'll take a shift too." Mason looked as though he might object, then thought better of it. "You can ride with me. 3rd shift, 2 hours before dawn." The next morning revealed no further sign of the mysterious riders, but the incident had put the entire crew on alert. They moved the herd with increased vigilance, eyes constantly scanning the surrounding terrain for potential threats. Their caution proved warranted on the 6th day when they reached a narrow pass that served as the most direct route to Helena. As the lead cattle entered the pass, shots rang out from the rocky slopes above, sending the animals into a panic. "Ambush!" Jorge shouted, wheeling his horse around as the herd threatened to scatter. Mason immediately took charge. "Luke, Matthew hold the rear. Will, Frank left flank. Jorge, Charlie try to turn the leaders before they bolt. Winnie had been riding near the center of the herd when the shooting began. Without hesitation, she spurred her mare toward the frightened cattle at the front, joining Jorge and Charlie in their attempt to prevent a stampede. More shots echoed through the pass, though it became clear the attackers were aiming to scatter the herd rather than harm the drovers. The strategy was obvious if the cattle dispersed into the surrounding wilderness. The Double B would lose valuable time recollecting them, possibly missing their delivery deadline. Mason appeared beside Winnie as they worked to turn the lead steers. "This is no random attack," he shouted over the chaos. "This is Wilkins trying to sabotage the drive. Then we won't let him succeed," Winnie called back, her face set with determination as she maneuvered her horse expertly among the panicking cattle. The combined efforts of the experienced hands gradually brought the situation under control. The herd, though agitated, remained largely intact, with only a few dozen animals breaking away into the surrounding hills. Once the immediate crisis had passed, Mason organized a pursuit of the attackers, leaving half the men with Winnie to guard the herd while he led the others up the rocky slopes. They returned an hour later, expressions grim. "They were gone before we could catch them," Mason reported, dismounting beside Winnie. "But we found this." He held up a bandana with a distinctive pattern one Winnie recognized immediately. "That belongs to one of Wilkins' men," she confirmed. "I saw several of them wearing those when they visited the ranch." Mason nodded grimly. "Confirmation if we needed it. Wilkins is determined to see us fail." "How many cattle did we lose?" Winnie asked, focusing on the practical impact of the attack. "Maybe 30 head, Jorge estimated." "We can round them up, but it'll cost us half a day at least." Winnie considered their options. The buyers in Helena were expecting delivery on a specific date. Any delay risked the entire transaction. Yet leaving even 30 cattle behind represented a significant financial loss. "We'll split up," she decided. "Most of the men will continue with the main herd while a small group recovers the strays. That way we keep to our schedule while minimizing our losses." "It's risky," Mason cautioned. "We're already short-handed, and dividing our forces further leaves both groups vulnerable." "More vulnerable than if Wilkins succeeds in preventing our delivery altogether," Winnie countered. "This is exactly what he wants to force us into impossible choices." After a moment's consideration, Mason nodded. "You're right. I'll take Charlie and Luke to round up the strays. The rest of you push on toward Helena. We'll catch up within a day." "I'm coming with you," Winnie stated firmly. "Winnie," Mason began, using her first name without thinking, "the main herd needs leadership." "And it will have it," she replied. "Jorge has been driving cattle for 20 years. He can lead the herd to Helena. But I won't ask you to risk yourselves recovering my cattle while I take the safer route." The conviction in her voice made further argument futile. Mason recognized the determined set of her jaw and knew she would not be dissuaded. "All right," he conceded. "We leave in 10 minutes." The tracking party set out immediately, following the scattered trails of the missing cattle into the rugged country surrounding the pass. Charlie's skills proved invaluable as he interpreted subtle signs that would have been invisible to less experienced eyes. By mid-afternoon, they had recovered nearly half the missing animals, gathering them in a small box canyon while they continued searching for the others. The work was exhausting, requiring them to navigate difficult terrain and coax reluctant cattle from their hiding places. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, they found the last significant Group 8 steers that had taken refuge in a secluded meadow. Luke and Charlie worked to herd them back toward their temporary holding area, while Mason and Winnie scouted ahead for the most direct route. They had just crested a small rise when Mason suddenly raised his hand, signaling Winnie to stop. His body tensed, eyes fixed on something in the distance. "What is it?" Winnie asked quietly, following his gaze but seeing nothing unusual. "Riders," Mason replied, voice low. "3 of them coming up from the south." Winnie squinted against the late afternoon sunlight. "Wilkins' men?" "Can't tell yet," Mason said, "but I'm not taking chances. Stay close." They retreated to a cluster of pine trees that offered concealment while maintaining a view of the approaching riders. As the figures drew nearer, Mason's expression hardened. "That's Powell," he confirmed, recognizing the wounded foreman they had captured during the rustling attempt. "He must have been released from custody and come straight back to Wilkins," Winnie concluded. "They're determined to stop us at any cost." Mason checked his revolver. "They haven't seen us yet. If we're quiet, they might pass by without incident." But luck was not with them. One of Powell's companions pointed toward the canyon where Luke and Charlie were gathering the recovered cattle. The 3 riders immediately altered their course, heading directly for the Double B hands. "They'll be outnumbered," Winnie realized with alarm. "We have to warn them." Without waiting for Mason's response, she mounted her mare and urged the animal forward, taking a route that would intercept Luke and Charlie before Powell's group reached them. Mason cursed under his breath but quickly followed, knowing that stealth was no longer an option. Their sudden appearance caught Powell by surprise. He reined his horse sharply, his companions following suit as Mason and Winnie emerged from the trees directly in their path. "That's far enough, Powell," Mason called, his revolver drawn but held deliberately at his side, a warning rather than an immediate threat. Powell's face twisted with recognition and hatred. "Buchanan, and the lady rancher." He spat the last words like an insult. "Didn't expect to find you out here doing a man's job. And yet here I am," Winnie replied evenly, "while you're once again trying to steal what isn't yours." "Ain't stealing to take what's already been lost," Powell retorted. "Those cattle broke from your herd. By rights, they belong to whoever finds them first." "That's not how the law sees it," Mason countered. "Those animals are clearly branded Double B, and you know it." Powell's hand hovered near his holster. "Law's a long way from here, Buchanan, and there's 3 of us against the 2 of you." "4 against 3, came Charlie's voice as he and Luke emerged from behind Powell's group, having spotted the confrontation and circled around. Both men had rifles ready, creating a standoff. Powell assessed the situation, clearly recognizing the disadvantage. "We ain't looking for a shooting match," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Mr. Wilkins just wanted us to make sure you understood his message." "And what message is that?" Winnie asked. "That perseverance has a price." Powell's eyes narrowed. "You might get these cattle to Helena, but this won't be the last obstacle you face. The Double B is more trouble than it's worth, Miss Blackett. Sooner or later you'll realize that." "Threats won't change my mind," Winnie stated firmly. "Tell Wilkins that if he wants my land, he'll have to find legal means to acquire it. Otherwise, he's just wasting his time and yours." For a moment, it seemed Powell might ignore the overwhelming odds and draw his weapon, but after a tense silence, he nodded curtly to his companions. "We're done here, for now." He turned his horse and rode away, the other men following reluctantly. Once they were out of sight, Winnie released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Will they be back?" she asked, turning to Mason. "Not today," he replied. "But Powell's right about one thing: this won't be the last obstacle Wilkins puts in our path." Charlie approached, his expression troubled. "We've got all the strays collected, but after this encounter, I'd suggest we rejoin the main herd as quickly as possible." "Agreed," Mason nodded. "Let's move these cattle out immediately. If we push hard, we might catch up with Jorge before nightfall." As they began herding the recovered cattle toward the trail, Winnie rode alongside Mason. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for backing my decision to come after the strays." It was the right choice. It was, Mason acknowledged, not just for the cattle, but because it showed Powell and Wilkins that you won't abandon what's yours, no matter the risk. He glanced at her, admiration evident in his expression. "That kind of resolve earns respect out here." "Even from you?" Winnie asked, a hint of teasing in her voice despite the seriousness of their situation. Mason's lips curved into a rare smile. "Especially from me." They rode in companionable silence after that, each contemplating the growing bond between them, a partnership forged through shared danger and mutual respect that was evolving into something neither had anticipated when they first met on the Double B. The remainder of the cattle drive proceeded without further interference from Wilkins or his men. Though everyone remained vigilant, it seemed the confrontation with Powell had temporarily discouraged further sabotage attempts. The reunited herd moved steadily toward Helena, making up lost time through careful management of rest periods and watering stops. Winnie continued to work alongside the hands, her competence and willingness to share in the hardships, earning genuine respect from even the most skeptical members of the crew. Each evening, she joined the men around the campfire, listening to their stories and sharing her own experiences, gradually weaving herself into the fabric of their community. Mason observed this transformation with quiet pride, recognizing that Winnie was becoming exactly the kind of leader the Double B needed, one who commanded respect not through authority alone, but through demonstrated ability and genuine concern for those under her care. It was a quality rare in any ranch owner, regardless of gender, and it confirmed what Mason had suspected from their first meeting. Winifred Blackett was exceptional in ways that had nothing to do with social conventions and everything to do with character. On the final night before reaching Helena, as the lights of the city glimmered in the distance, Winnie found a moment of solitude away from the camp. She stood on a small rise, watching the sleeping herd in the valley below while contemplating the enormity of what they had accomplished. The soft crunch of boots on dry grass announced Mason's approach. He joined her in silence, respecting her contemplative mood. "We made it," Winnie said after a moment, her voice soft with wonder and relief. "Despite everything, Wilkins, the ambush, all the doubts, we actually made it." "Did you ever truly doubt we would?" Mason asked, genuinely curious. Winnie considered the question. "Not exactly doubt, but I was afraid. Afraid of failing my father's legacy, afraid of proving right everyone who said a woman couldn't run a ranch. And now I'm just grateful," she admitted, "for the men who stayed loyal to the Double B, for the weather holding for." She hesitated, then finished honestly, "For you, Mason. I couldn't have done this without you." "You could have," he corrected gently. "It would have been harder, certainly, but never doubt your own capability, Winnie. Everything I've seen these past weeks confirms what your father knew. You were born to lead this ranch." His confidence in her brought unexpected tears to Winnie's eyes. She blinked them away quickly, embarrassed by the display of emotion. "Well, tomorrow we'll complete the sale, and then we can begin planning for the ranch's future. The income from these cattle will secure us through winter at least." Mason nodded, though something in his expression had changed at her mention of the future. "About that," he began, an uncharacteristic hesitation in his voice. "I've been meaning to speak with you about what happens after Helena." A sudden chill that had nothing to do with the night air settled over Winnie. "You're leaving," she stated, the realization landing like a physical blow. "I haven't decided," Mason replied, though his tone lacked conviction. "I've had an offer from a ranch in Wyoming. Good position, fair pay." "I see." Winnie fought to keep her voice steady. "When would you go?" "That's just it, I don't know that I will." Mason turned to face her directly, moonlight silvering his features. "I gave my word that you wouldn't have to do this alone, and I meant it. But I need to know if there's a reason for me to stay beyond that promise." The question hung between them, its implications clear. This was no longer about employment or professional loyalty. Mason was asking about possibilities that Winnie had scarcely allowed herself to contemplate, possibilities that both thrilled and terrified her. "Mason, she began, uncertain how to express the tumult of emotions his question had unleashed. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Jorge, his expression apologetic but his message urgent. "Sorry to intrude, but we've got visitors. A man claiming to be from the Helena Cattlemen's Association says he needs to speak with you immediately, Miss Blackett." Concern immediately replaced all other emotions. "At this hour? What does he want?" "Wouldn't say exactly," Jorge replied. "Just that it's about tomorrow's sale and can't wait till morning." Winnie exchanged a worried glance with Mason. "This feels wrong," she said quietly. "Why wouldn't our buyers wait until we reach the city?" "Only one way to find out," Mason replied, his personal question set aside in the face of this new development. "Let's hear what he has to say, but carefully." The visitor waited by the main campfire, a well-dressed man with the smooth manner and practiced smile of someone accustomed to business negotiations. He introduced himself as Edward Harrison, representative of the Helena Cattlemen's Association. "Miss Blackett," he greeted Winnie with exaggerated courtesy. "I apologize for the late hour, but I felt it crucial to speak with you before you bring your herd to market." "What's so urgent that it couldn't wait until morning, Mr. Harrison?" Winnie asked, making no effort to hide her suspicion. Harrison's smile dimmed slightly at her directness. "I regret to inform you that there's been a complication with your arrangement. The association has been forced to reduce its purchase offer by 20%. 20%, Winnie repeated incredulously. "The price was agreed upon weeks ago. We've driven these cattle hundreds of miles based on that agreement." "Unfortunate market fluctuations," Harrison explained with practiced regret. "Beef prices have fallen unexpectedly. The association simply cannot honor the original price without incurring significant losses." Mason stepped forward, his expression skeptical. "Strange that we've heard nothing about falling prices from other ranchers heading to market." "It's a very recent development," Harrison replied smoothly. "Too recent to be legitimate," Winnie countered, her mind working quickly. "Mr. Harrison, did Horace Wilkins approach you or other members of the association recently?" The question clearly caught Harrison off guard. His hesitation before responding confirmed Winnie's suspicion. "I'm not at liberty to discuss the association's other business relationships." "You don't need to," Winnie replied, her resolve hardening. "This complication has Wilkins written all over it. He couldn't stop our cattle drive, so now he's trying to devalue our sale." Harrison's discomfort was now evident. "Miss Blackett, I assure you, save your assurances," Winnie interrupted. "Here's what's going to happen, Mr. Harrison. Tomorrow we will drive our cattle to Helena as planned. If the Cattlemen's Association honors our original agreement, excellent. If not, we'll take our business elsewhere. There are no other buyers with the capacity to purchase your entire herd," Harrison countered, his friendly facade slipping. "Then we'll sell to multiple buyers," Winnie stated firmly. "Or we'll continue on to Butte, or even as far as Cheyenne if necessary. But we will not accept a reduced price based on phantom market fluctuations orchestrated by Horace Wilkins." Harrison studied her for a long moment, clearly reassessing the woman before him. "I'll convey your position to the association," he finally said, but I wouldn't expect a favorable response. That's your prerogative, Winnie replied evenly. Good night, Mr. Harrison. After the man departed, the camp erupted in concerned discussion. The men had overheard enough to understand the threat to their successful drive, and opinions varied on how to proceed. We could split the herd and sell to smaller buyers, Jorge suggested. It'd be complicated but possible, or push on to Butt, Sam added. It's another week's drive, but the prices might be better. Mason remained silent throughout the discussion, observing Winnie as she listened to each suggestion. When all had spoken, she turned to him. What do you think, Mason? I think, he replied deliberately, that Harrison will be back at the association before dawn, reporting that his intimidation failed. And I think Horace Wilkins is about to learn that he's underestimated you again. Winnie nodded, a plan forming in her mind. Jorge, how many cattle have we lost since leaving the Double B? Maybe 40 head total, Jorge calculated. Less than we expected, honestly. And all our cattle are in good condition, healthy, well-fed. Best-looking herd to hit Helena this season, Jorge confirmed proudly. Winnie smiled, determination lighting her eyes. Then here's what we're going to do. The next morning, the Double B herd entered Helena not as expected through the eastern approach to the stockyards, but rather through the main thoroughfare of the city itself. The unusual spectacle of 800 cattle parading down Helena's central avenue created exactly the stir Winnie had intended. Dressed in her finest riding clothes, practical yet unmistakably feminine, she led the procession alongside Mason. Behind them came the entire crew, each man groomed and attired in their best, presenting the image of a successful, professional operation. Citizens lined the streets, watching with a mixture of amusement and appreciation as the impressive herd moved through town. Among the spectators were numerous businessmen and potential buyers drawn by the unprecedented display. By the time they reached the stockyards, word of the Double B ticket's arrival had spread throughout Helena's business community. Representatives from multiple cattle buyers, including several who competed with the Helena Cattlemen's Association, waited to inspect the herd. Harrison was there as well, his expression a mixture of anger and grudging respect as he observed the crowd Winnie had attracted. Beside him stood a distinguished older gentleman Winnie didn't recognize until Mason leaned close to whisper, "That's Jacob Reynolds, president of the Cattlemen's Association." Reynolds approached as Winnie dismounted, his assessment of her open and curious. "Miss Blackett, I presume. You've caused quite a stir this morning." "Mr. Reynolds," Winnie acknowledged with a polite nod. "I believed it important that Helena's citizens see the quality of Double B cattle for themselves. Transparency benefits everyone in business, wouldn't you agree?" A hint of amusement touched Reynolds' face. "Indeed, though I understand from Mr. Harrison that you have concerns about our adjusted offer." "Not concerns, Mr. Reynolds' outright rejection," Winnie corrected firmly. "The Double B delivers what it promises, premium cattle, on time, exactly as agreed. We expect the same courtesy from our business partners." Reynolds studied the herd thoughtfully. "They are exceptional animals," he admitted. "But Mr. Harrison explained about the market conditions. With all due respect," Mason interjected. "We've spoken with other buyers who seem unaware of these supposed market fluctuations. In fact," he gestured towards several well-dressed men examining the cattle, "they appear quite eager to pay premium prices for quality stock." Reynolds' gaze sharpened as he registered the competition. "I see. And you would sell to these alternative buyers?" "Rather than honor your arrangement with the association, we intended to honor our arrangement," Winnie replied pointedly. "It was the association that attempted to change terms at the last moment. A long moment of consideration followed before Reynolds nodded, decision made. It seems I've been misinformed about certain aspects of this transaction. The association will honor the original agreement, Miss Blackett. The full price, as negotiated. Relief washed through Winnie, though she maintained her composed exterior. I'm pleased we could reach an understanding, Mr. Reynolds. As am I, he replied, then added more quietly, and I would be interested to hear at a more appropriate time about these obstacles you encountered on your journey. The association values integrity in its business relationships with all parties. The implication was clear. Reynolds suspected Wilkins' interference and was not pleased about it. Winnie nodded her understanding. I would be happy to provide that information. With the sale secured at the original price, the mood among the Double B hands transformed to jubilant celebration. The cattle were counted and transferred to the association's holding pens. Paperwork was completed, and payment was made in full, a substantial sum that represented not just financial security for the ranch but vindication of Winnie's leadership. That evening, she hosted a dinner for the entire crew at Helena's finest hotel, a gesture of appreciation for their loyalty and hard work. The men, initially uncomfortable in such elegant surroundings, soon relaxed into boisterous storytelling and laughter, recounting the adventures of their journey and speculating on the future of the Double B. Throughout the meal, Winnie was acutely aware of Mason's presence beside her. Their interrupted conversation from the previous night lingered between them, unresolved but impossible to forget. The Wyoming offer remained unanswered, and with the drive now successfully completed, the question of what came next could no longer be avoided. When the celebration finally wound down and the men departed for more familiar entertainments in Helena's saloons, Winnie and Mason found themselves alone in the hotel's small garden. The evening air was cool but pleasant, stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky above. You did it, Mason said simply. Everything they said you couldn't do, you proved them wrong. We did it, Winnie corrected. I meant what I said before, Mason. I couldn't have succeeded without you. Mason shook his head slightly. You give me too much credit. The vision was yours, the courage was yours. I just helped with the execution. Is that all it was to you? Winnie asked quietly. Just executing a plan. The question hung between them, its meaning extending far beyond the cattle drive or the ranch's operations. Mason's gaze met hers, searching for something he seemed afraid to name. No, he finally answered. It became much more than that. Winnie gathered her courage. Last night, before we were interrupted, you asked if there was a reason for you to stay beyond your promise that I wouldn't face this alone. I did, Mason acknowledged. The truth is, Winnie continued, her heart racing, I've grown accustomed to your presence, your counsel, your steadiness, your... She hesitated, then finished honestly, your friendship. The thought of continuing without those things is difficult to contemplate. Friendship, Mason repeated, testing the word as if measuring its adequacy. Is that what you want from me, Winnie? Friendship? The directness of his question demanded equal honesty in response. No, she admitted softly, not only friendship. Mason stepped closer, close enough that Winnie could see the flecks of gray in his blue eyes, the slight unevenness of his beard where an old scar interrupted its growth, the softening of his usually stern expression. Then what do you want? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I want you to stay, Winnie answered simply. Not as an employee, not only as a friend, but as... Words failed her, the conventions of proper speech inadequate to express the complexity of her feelings. Mason saved her from the struggle, his hand gently lifting to touch her cheek. As a partner, he suggested, in all things. Yes, she breathed, the single word carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken ones. When his lips met hers, Winnie understood with perfect clarity what her mother had tried to explain years ago about love, how it could feel simultaneously like coming home and embarking on the greatest adventure of one's life. Mason's kiss was gentle yet confident, respectful yet unmistakably passionate, much like the man himself. When they finally parted, Mason rested his forehead against hers, his hands steady at her waist. "I should warn you," he said with a hint of humor in his voice, "I've never been particularly good at taking orders." Winnie laughed softly. "And I've never been particularly good at giving them. Perhaps we can find a middle ground." "Partners," Mason repeated, the word a promise between them. "Partners," Winnie agreed, sealing the pact with another kiss. The return journey to the Double B was markedly different from the outbound cattle drive. With their mission accomplished and financial security assured for the immediate future, a sense of optimism permeated the group. The men, their pockets heavy with their shares of the drive's profits, spoke enthusiastically about improvements they hoped to make to the ranch and plans for expanding the herd in the coming year. For Winnie and Mason, the journey provided precious time to deepen their understanding of each other without the immediate pressures of the drive or Wilkins' interference. They rode side by side, sharing stories of their respective pasts and dreams for the future, discovering layers of compatibility that extended far beyond their working relationship. Mason spoke of his years of drifting after his mother's death, of the emptiness he'd felt despite constant movement, of his growing desire for a place to call his own. Winnie shared her frustrations with Philadelphia society, where her intelligence and ambition were considered liabilities rather than assets, and her determination to honor her father's legacy by making the Double B thrive. "He would have liked you," Winnie commented one evening as they sat slightly apart from the others around the campfire. "My father, I mean. He valued straightforward people who said what they meant and meant what they said." "I wish I could have known him," Mason replied. "The man who raised such a remarkable daughter must have been extraordinary himself." The compliment brought a soft smile to Winnie's lips. "He was. Stubborn as the day is long, but fair and forward-thinking. He never treated me differently from the son. He never had taught me riding, roping, and ranching alongside my lessons in literature and mathematics." "And your mother, did she approve of this unorthodox education?" "Not entirely," Winnie admitted. "She was more traditional, worried that I'd become unmarriageable if I didn't learn proper feminine arts. That's why she took me east after I turned 14 to finish me in Philadelphia society." A hint of sadness touched her expression. "We argued frequently. I think she feared I'd end up alone, managing a remote ranch with no family of my own." Mason reached for her hand, entwining their fingers. "And now, what would she think of your choices?" Winnie considered the question thoughtfully. "I think she'd be surprised, but pleased to see that I found a way to honor both their legacies, father's determination and mother's belief in the importance of connection." She squeezed his hand gently, though she might have preferred I find a banker or lawyer rather than a cowboy. "Too predictable," Mason grinned. "You were clearly destined for a more adventurous match." As they neared the Double B, anticipation built among the returning party. For most, the ranch had become more than employment. It was home, a community they had helped preserve through their loyalty and hard work during the drive. However, the peaceful homecoming they anticipated was not to be. As they crested the final ridge overlooking the ranch, smoke rose from the direction of the northern pastures. "Fire," Sam called out, pointing toward the ominous gray column rising against the clear sky. Without hesitation, the entire group spurred their mounts forward, racing toward the smoke. As they drew closer, they could see flames consuming a section of dry grass near the boundary with Wilkins' property. The fire had not yet reached any structures, but was spreading rapidly toward the main grazing lands. "The creek will stop it from reaching the house," Mason assessed quickly, "but if it jumps that ridgeline, we'll lose the best pasture on the property." "We need to create a fire break," Winnie decided, her mind racing through options. "Jorge, take half the men and collect every shovel and blanket from the ranch buildings. Charlie, you and the others ride ahead and see if you can redirect the southern edge of the fire toward the creek." The men separated according to her instructions, moving with the urgency the situation demanded. Winnie and Mason rode directly toward the advancing flames, assessing the fire's behavior and identifying the most critical points for intervention. "This wasn't an accident," Mason stated grimly as they observed the fire's origin point. "It started too close to our boundary with Wilkins, and there have been no lightning storms." "One last attempt to damage the Double B," Winnie agreed, anger evident in her voice. "He must have heard about our successful sale in Helena." "We can deal with Wilkins later," Mason replied, focus shifting to the immediate threat. "Right now, we need to save the ranch." For the next several hours, everyone on the Double B fought the fire with everything they had. They dug fire breaks, used wet blankets to smother advancing flames, and strategically backburned areas to deprive the main fire of fuel. The work was exhausting and dangerous, with smoke burning their lungs and heat searing their skin despite protective clothing. Winnie worked alongside the men, her determination inspiring even greater efforts from the crew. Her knowledge of the land proved invaluable in deciding where to concentrate their limited resources for maximum effect. As dusk approached, their combined efforts began to show results. The fire's advance slowed and then halted along critical sections, though several smaller blazes continued to burn in less valuable areas where they would eventually burn themselves out against natural barriers. Exhausted but triumphant, the crew gathered near the creek to assess their success. Faces blackened with soot, clothing singed and dirty, they nonetheless shared smiles of accomplishment. "We've contained it," Jorge confirmed, wiping sweat from his brow. "Lost maybe 100 acres of grazing land, but saved the prime pastures and all the buildings." "Everyone did extraordinary work," Winnie acknowledged, her voice hoarse from smoke but filled with gratitude. "The Double B stands because of your efforts today." As the men headed toward the ranch house for well-deserved rest and food, Mason drew Winnie aside. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "Wilkins isn't going to stop." "I know," Winnie sighed, the weight of the ongoing conflict heavy on her smoke-weary shoulders. "But what more can he do? We've overcome every obstacle he's placed in our path." "Men like Wilkins don't accept defeat," Mason warned. "Each failure only makes them more determined and potentially more dangerous." "Then we'll be ready," Winnie stated firmly. "The Double B has survived drought, blizzards, rustlers, and now fire. Whatever Wilkins tries next, we'll face it together." Mason nodded, pride evident in his expression despite his concern. "Together," he agreed, the word both acknowledgement and promise. The following morning, as the crew assessed the damage in daylight and began repairs to affected fence lines, a rider approached from the direction of Wallace. It was young Sam Peterson's brother, Robert, who worked at the general store in town. "Miss Blackett," he called as he dismounted in the ranch yard. "Got news you need to hear right away." Winnie and Mason met him on the porch, noting his urgency. "What's happened, Robert?" "It's Wilkins," Robert reported, accepting a cup of water gratefully. "Marshal Dawson arrested him yesterday. Him and 3 of his men, including Powell. The news was so unexpected that Winnie couldn't immediately process it. Arrested? On what charges? Conspiracy, fraud, attempted arson, and cattle rustling, Robert recited. Turns out that buyer who tried to reduce your sale price in Helena Harrison confessed everything when the Cattlemen's Association confronted him. Said Wilkins had been bribing him for years to manipulate cattle prices. Mason whistled softly. Reynolds made good on his promise to investigate. That's not all, Robert continued excitedly. After Harrison talked, Marshal Dawson got a warrant to search Wilkins' ranch. Found stolen cattle from 3 different spreads, including some double B stock from that rustling attempt back in June. And they caught one of his hands red-handed trying to burn evidence papers, showing he'd been planning to drive you out for months. The implications were staggering. Not only was Wilkins facing serious charges, but his scheme to acquire the double B had been thoroughly exposed. The threat that had hung over the ranch since Winnie's return had been eliminated not through direct confrontation, but through Wilkins' own arrogance and criminality. What happens now? Winnie asked, still processing the dramatic turn of events. Trial's set for next month in Helena, Robert replied. Marshal Dawson said you'll likely be called to testify, along with those rustlers who were caught on your property. After Robert departed with thanks and a hot meal for his trouble, Winnie and Mason walked to the ridge overlooking the ranch. The burn scar from yesterday's fire was clearly visible, a black swath cutting across the northern pastures, but already the extent of what they had saved was equally apparent. The vast majority of the double B remained intact and productive. It's really over, Winnie marveled, the realization gradually sinking in. Wilkins can't hurt the ranch anymore. Not Wilkins specifically, Mason agreed, though ranching always brings challenges. Drought, harsh winters, market fluctuations, those will continue regardless. True, Winnie acknowledged, but those are natural challenges faced by every ranch, not deliberate sabotage by a greedy neighbor. They stood in comfortable silence, surveying the property that had become home to them both. The double B sprawled across the landscape, a testament to Thomas Blackett's vision and his daughter's determination to preserve it. So, Mason said finally, turning to face Winnie directly, with Wilkins no longer a threat and the ranch financially secure after the cattle sale, what comes next for the double B? The question was genuine, without presumption, despite their deepening relationship. Mason understood that the ranch represented more than property. To Winnie it was her heritage and her future, an entity with needs and potential that existed independently of personal considerations. Winnie considered thoughtfully before responding. Expansion, I think. The fire showed our vulnerability to losing grazing land. With Wilkins' property likely to be sold to satisfy legal judgments, we might have an opportunity to acquire additional acreage. Thinking like a true rancher already, Mason observed with approval. Any other plans? Improvements to the main house, Winnie continued, a slight blush coloring her cheeks. It served well for a single occupant, but if the owner were to consider a more permanent arrangement with someone, certain modifications might be necessary. Mason's expression softened at her meaning. Such as a larger kitchen, perhaps, Winnie suggested, moving closer to him. Additional bedrooms for future considerations, maybe even one of those indoor water pumps I saw in Helena. Sounds ambitious, Mason commented, though his eyes reflected her vision. And expensive. Worthwhile investments, Winnie countered, for a ranch with a secure future. Mason took both her hands in his expression shifting from playful to serious. Winnie, I need to be clear about something. I didn't stay for the ranch, though it's fine land with excellent prospects. I stayed for you. If tomorrow you decided to sell everything and move to Boston, I'd follow you there." The declaration, so simply stated yet so profound in its implications, touched Winnie deeply. "I have no intention of leaving the Double B," she assured him, "but knowing you value me above the ranch means everything." "Then there's only one question left," Mason said, his voice steady despite the significance of the moment. "Winifred Blackett, would you consider a permanent partnership one that extends beyond ranch operations to every aspect of our lives?" Though she had anticipated this conversation since their return from Helena, the reality of it standing on her father's land with the man who had stood beside her through every challenge brought tears to Winnie's eyes. "I would consider it," she replied, matching his formal tone before breaking into a radiant smile, "and accept it most enthusiastically." Mason's answering smile transformed his usually serious features. He drew her into his arms, sealing their agreement with a kiss that promised a lifetime of partnership in all things. When they finally separated, Winnie rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "They said a woman couldn't run a ranch," she murmured, recalling the doubts that had greeted her return to Montana. "They were wrong," Mason replied simply. "You've proven that beyond any doubt." "Perhaps," Winnie acknowledged, "but I'm grateful I didn't have to prove it entirely alone." She looked up at him, eyes shining with both love and determination. "The Double B will always be my father's legacy, but what we build from here will be ours together." "I can't imagine anything I'd want more," Mason assured her, his arms tightening around her waist. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, casting long shadows across the land they both loved, Winnie and Mason remained on the ridge, planning their future with the same determination and courage that had brought them through the challenges of the past. The Double B had not just survived, it would thrive under their joint stewardship, a testament to what was possible when prejudice gave way to partnership and love overcame limitation. In the years that followed, the story of Winifred Blackett and Mason Buchanan became something of a legend in Wallace County. The woman who defied convention to claim her birthright, and the cowboy who stood beside her rather than in front of her, represented a new kind of partnership that gradually transformed ranching culture throughout the territory. Their wedding the following spring was attended by ranchers and cowboys from 3 counties, many of whom had initially doubted Winnie's capability, but now came to pay genuine respect. Marshall Dawson himself gave the bride away in Thomas Blackett's absence, and Charlie surprised everyone with a beautiful Blackfoot blessing for the union. The Double B expanded steadily under their management, eventually incorporating portions of the former Wilkins property and becoming one of the most successful operations in Montana territory. Their innovative approaches to cattle breeding and land management were widely adopted, and Winnie's insistence on fair treatment of all workers made the ranch a sought-after employer. Their first child, a son they named Thomas after Winnie's father, arrived a year after their marriage, followed 2 years later by a daughter, Elizabeth, named for Mason's mother. The children grew up immersed in ranch life, learning both practical skills and the values their parents held dear: integrity, perseverance, and respect for all people regardless of conventional expectations. When asked about her success, Winnie always gave the same answer. "They said a woman couldn't run a ranch. My husband stood beside me and said she won't do it alone. And together, we proved what's possible when we judge people by their character and capability rather than their gender or background." It was a lesson that resonated far beyond the boundaries of the Double B, shaping the evolving society of the American West and offering hope to others who dared to challenge the limitations others placed upon them. For in Winnie and Mason's story lay a fundamental truth about human potential, that the greatest achievements often come not from conforming to expectations, but from having the courage to defy them, especially when supported by those who believe in you. And as the Double B thrived through changing seasons and passing years, it stood as living proof that the most powerful words in any language might be these: "You won't do it alone.